History tells us Vikings wore horned helmets, fearsome crowns for their savage conquests, but not a single one has ever been found. It tells us they were filthy, unwashed brutes, yet archaeologists keep digging up exquisite combs, tweezers, and even delicate ear spoons from their grave sites, suggesting a people far more concerned with grooming than the stories give them credit for. The tales paint them as godless pagans, but their belief in fate, in honor, and in the intricate connections between worlds was so profound it governed every choice they made, from birth until their final fated breath. What we think we know about the Norsemen is often just the beginning of a much deeper, more complex, and far more human story. It's a story not just of fire and steel, but of family, of law, of art, and of a relentless, defiant curiosity that would carry them to the very edges of the known world, and even a little beyond. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As you settle in for tonight's story, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always a little magical to think about us all connected by this single story, across so many miles and time zones. Now, let the world outside fade away, and let's travel back to a time before the Viking Age had a name. Our story begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic lapping of water against a rocky shore in the land they simply called home. Scandinavia. Picture it in the late 8th century. There is no Denmark, no Norway, no Sweden as we know them. Instead, the land is a fractured mosaic of fjords, forests, and fertile patches, ruled by local chieftains and petty kings, whose influence rarely stretched beyond the next valley or island. Life was governed by the seasons, a harsh and demanding cycle. The winters were long, dark, and isolating, a time for huddling in the smoky warmth of the longhouse, mending tools, weaving cloth, and telling stories of gods and heroes to pass the endless nights. The arrival of spring was a joyous explosion of life, heralding the short, frantic summer season of planting, building, and trading. For the vast majority of the population, the Carls or freemen, life was tied to the family farm. These were not the sprawling plantations of other lands, but small, hard-won plots of earth, cleared from the dense forest or clinging to the edge of a fjord. They grew hardy crops like barley, oats, and rye, and raised cattle, sheep, and goats. It was a life of constant grinding work. They weren't exactly enjoying a Mediterranean diet of sun-ripened olives and wine. Think more along the lines of porridge, flatbread, dried fish, and for a special treat, slightly different porridge. Yet these Carls were the backbone of Norse society. They were beholden to a local jarl or chieftain, but they were not serfs. They owned their land, carried weapons, and had a voice in the local assembly, the Thing, where disputes were settled and laws were made. Above the Carls were the jarls, the aristocracy. These were the leaders in war and peace, whose wealth was measured in land, followers, and silver. A jarl's power was personal, built on a reputation for generosity, wisdom and judgment, and crucially, success in acquiring wealth to reward his loyal warriors, his hird. Below everyone were the thralls, the enslaved. These were people captured in local squabbles, those born into slavery, or those who had fallen into debt. They did the heaviest labor on the farms and in the households, and their lives were entirely at the whim of their owners. This three-tiered structure, jarl, carl, thrall, formed the bedrock of their world. For centuries, this world had been relatively self-contained. The sea, which we so often associate with their outward explosion, was first and foremost their internal highway. It was far easier to travel by boat along the jagged coastline than to trek through the dense, trackless forests and over the high mountains. The water connected communities, it didn't separate them. They were, by necessity, a maritime people, long before they were Vikings. Their entire existence was oriented towards the water, for fishing, for travel, and for trade among themselves. But something was beginning to change. The population was growing, and good, arable land was becoming scarce. A farmer might have 3 or 4 sons, but the farm could only support one family. The younger sons faced a stark choice: hire themselves out as laborers or find their fortune elsewhere. It was the ultimate medieval version of being told to get a job and move out of your parents' basement. This created a growing pool of restless, ambitious young men with everything to prove and very little to lose. At the same time, the chieftains and jarls were in constant competition with one another, vying for prestige and power. The best way to attract and keep loyal followers was to be a source of riches: silver, weapons, exotic goods. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the coming age of raiding was this internal political pressure, a desperate hunger for new land, or simply a growing awareness of the vulnerable wealth that lay just across the water. Most likely, it was a perfect storm of all three. Through limited, peaceful trade, the Norse had glimpsed the riches of their neighbors. They had seen the silver flowing out of the Frankish Empire under Charlemagne, and heard tales of the wealthy, undefended monasteries of England. For a people who valued courage and decisive action, the conclusion was simple and utterly pragmatic. Why trade for a trickle of silver when you could take the entire fountain? All they needed was the right tool to make it happen, and that tool, when it arrived in its perfected form, was a masterpiece of lethal elegance. It was the longship. To understand the Viking Age, one must first understand the vessel that gave it wings. This was no mere boat. It was a key that unlocked the world. We know this not just from the sagas or the frantic chronicles of their victims, but from the ghosts of ships themselves, pulled almost perfectly preserved from the sacred earth of burial mounds at places like Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway. These silent relics speak volumes about the genius of their builders. The design had evolved over centuries, a slow and careful refinement, but by the late 700s, it had reached its apex. Imagine a master shipwright, a man whose knowledge was passed down through generations, not in books, but in the feeling of wood grain beneath his calloused thumb. He would walk the forest, not looking for just any tree, but for the right tree. Tall, straight oaks for the keel and ribs, flexible ash for certain frames, and ancient pines for the long, overlapping planks of the hull. The planks, or strakes, were the heart of the ship's secret. They were not sawed, which would sever the wood's natural fibers and create weakness. Instead, the logs were painstakingly split with wedges, following the grain, ensuring each plank retained the innate, living strength of the tree it came from. These strakes were then laid in the clinker-built style, each one overlapping the one below it, like shingles on a roof. They were fastened together with iron rivets, hammered in from the outside, with a washer-like plate called a rove clenched tight on the inside. This technique created a hull that was both incredibly strong and shockingly flexible. A longship didn't fight the waves. It danced with them. It could twist and bend in a heavy sea, absorbing the immense pressure of the North Atlantic. where a more rigid vessel would have been smashed to pieces. The ship felt alive, its timbers groaning and flexing like the muscles of some great sea serpent, and it was shaped like one too, long, narrow, and graceful. It sat high in the water, a feature known as a shallow draft. This was arguably its greatest strategic advantage. A deep-hulled merchant ship of the era needed a proper harbor, a designated port to dock and unload. But a longship could sail right up a shallow river, gliding silently inland for miles. It could navigate estuaries and marshes, and when it reached a target, it didn't need a dock at all. The crew could simply run it straight onto a sandy beach, leap over the sides, and launch their attack before any alarm could be effectively raised. It was the 8th century equivalent of an all-terrain vehicle, equally at home on the brutal North Sea, and in a quiet little river that had never seen anything more threatening than a duck. This versatility was enhanced by its double-ended, symmetrical design. The bow and the stern were nearly identical. This meant the ship could be reversed without the slow, clumsy process of turning around. If a raid went sour or a superior force appeared, the crew could simply face the other way, man the oars, and execute a swift retreat back the way they came. Propulsion was a brilliant hybrid system. In the open sea, a single, enormous square sail, woven from wool and often reinforced with leather strips, would catch the wind, pushing the ship along at surprising speeds, some scholars estimating up to 15 knots in ideal conditions. But when the wind died, or when stealth and maneuverability were needed, the sail came down and the crew took to the oars. Along the length of the ship were oar ports, which could be sealed with small wooden plugs when under sail to keep water out. The rhythmic pull of 30 or more pairs of oars could give the ship a terrifying burst of speed, making it seem to creep over the water towards its horrified observers on the shore. Life aboard was anything but comfortable. These were open boats, completely exposed to the elements. The crew, typically between 40 and 80 men, would eat and sleep in the same space they worked. Their personal sea chests, containing their few possessions, were cleverly designed to be the exact height of the rowing benches, so they could sit on them to row. Personal space was not a concept that had been invented yet, unless your personal space included the armpit of the man rowing next to you. They would be constantly damp from sea spray and rain, their survival dependent on woolen cloaks and their own hardiness. Steering was accomplished not by a central rudder, but by a large steering oar, a steer board mounted on the right side of the stern, which is the origin of our modern word starboard. And finally, there was the matter of psychology. The Norsemen understood that warfare was not just about physical strength, but about terror. The prows of their warships were often crowned with fearsome, intricately carved heads of dragons and serpents. These weren't just for decoration. They were meant to be the first thing their victims saw, a mythological monster emerging from the mist, a terrifying promise of the violence to come. As they neared their own lands, these heads were often removed, so as not to frighten the friendly local spirits, the landvetter. With their tool perfected, those restless young men from the crowded farmsteads and the ambitious chieftains seeking glory now had their chariot. The longship was a weapon, a troop transport, and a getaway car, all rolled into one sleek, terrifying package. The coasts of Europe lay open before them, utterly unprepared for what was about to happen. And then it happened. The quiet, pastoral world of 8th century Europe was about to receive a very rude awakening. The first blow, the one that would echo through the chronicles for centuries, landed on a place that was, by its very nature, the most vulnerable and the most sacred. It was a small tidal island off the coast of Northumbria in northern England, a place known simply as Lindisfarne, but to the people of Anglo-Saxon England, and indeed to all of Christendom, it was the Holy Island, a revered center of learning and faith. It was here that St. Cuthbert had lived and prayed, and his relics lay enshrined in the island's priory. It was a place where monks, in the quiet solitude of their scriptorium, produced breathtaking works of art and faith, like the magnificently illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels. They were scholars and saints, whose biggest daily conflict was likely a debate over the correct ink mixture for a manuscript, not how to repel a boarding party of heavily armed sea wolves. Lindisfarne was a symbol of peace, a beacon of Christian scholarship in a still barbarous world. It was, in short, the softest of targets. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of the kingdom's history, notes that the year 793 began with dire omens. Here terrible portents came about over the land of Northumbria, the entry reads, and miserably frightened the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. To the deeply superstitious people of the age, it was a clear sign that something was wrong, that the heavens themselves were distressed. They wouldn't have to wait long to find out why. On the 8th of June, on a calm summer's day, the monks would have seen them first as specks on the horizon, growing steadily larger. Strange ships, unlike the familiar, tubby merchant cogs that occasionally visited. These were long, sleek, and menacing, with those terrifying serpent-like heads rearing up from the prow, seeming to taste the wind. There would have been a moment of confusion, perhaps even curiosity, before the panic set in. The long ships, with their shallow draft, didn't need to find the island's small harbor. They simply slid onto the beach, their keels grinding on the sand. The quiet air of prayer was shattered by the harsh war cries of a foreign tongue. Men poured over the sides of the ships, large bearded men armed with long-bladed axes, spears, and round shields. For the monks of Lindisfarne, it must have seemed as though the fiery dragons seen in the sky had materialized from the sea itself, creatures of nightmare made real. They had nowhere to run. The violence was swift, brutal, and utterly profane. The raiders stormed into the church, a place of sanctuary they viewed with utter indifference. To the Norsemen, this wasn't a house of God. It was a treasure chest waiting to be opened. To the raiders, it must have seemed like a divinely approved business opportunity, a building stuffed with gold and silver, with no security guards, and a staff who were contractually obligated not to fight back. They hacked down the monks who stood in their way, their blood staining the sacred altar. They smashed open reliquaries, pried the jewels from the covers of holy books, and bundled up the golden crosses and silver chalices. Anything of value that was portable was seized. They cared nothing for the sacred texts, only for the precious metals that adorned them. Those monks who weren't killed were rounded up, bound, and dragged back to the ships, destined for a new life of servitude as thralls. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, leaving behind a scene of smoldering ruins, desecrated holy ground, and unimaginable horror. The news of the sack of Lindisfarne sent a shockwave of terror across the Christian world. It wasn't the first raid, as small-scale attacks had likely occurred before, but it was the first to strike at the very heart of Christian identity in the region. The scholar Alcuin, a Northumbrian churchman, serving at the court of the great Emperor Charlemagne in Francia, received the news and was plunged into despair. In a letter to the King of Northumbria, he captured the sheer psychological trauma of the event. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. He wrote, "The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." Alcuin's letters reveal a world turned upside down. How could God allow this? How could the holy sanctuary of St. Cuthbert be so violated by godless men? Was it a punishment for the sins of the Northumbrian people? This was the true impact of Lindisfarne. It wasn't just the loss of life or treasure, it was a theological crisis. It established the image of the Norsemen in the European mind, not as mere pirates, but as a demonic scourge, the fury of the Northmen, from which priests would soon add a new line to their prayers. The attack on Lindisfarne announced their arrival on the world stage, not with a whisper, but with a terrifying, sacrilegious scream. The age of raiding had begun. The scream from Lindisfarne was not an isolated cry. It was merely the opening note of a grim new symphony that would soon be played all along the coasts of northern Europe. Having tasted the vulnerable wealth of Northumbria, the Norsemen expanded their horizons. Their longships, perfectly suited for island hopping, soon turned their dragon prows towards the Celtic world, the Scottish Isles, and most invitingly, Ireland. Much like England, Ireland in the late 8th century was a land of deep faith and profound learning, the Isle of Saints and Scholars. It was also, conveniently for the raiders, a land with no central authority. Power was a volatile and shifting concept, divided among more than 100 local kings and chieftains, each ruling their own small territory or tuath. Trying to get the Irish kings to unite against a common enemy was like trying to herd cats, except the cats all had their own armies and deeply held grudges against the other cats. This political fragmentation, combined with the island's great monastic wealth, made it an irresistible target. In 795, just 2 years after Lindisfarne, the raiders struck again. This time, the target was the sacred island of Iona, the mother house of Celtic Christianity, founded by the revered Saint Columba himself. The story repeated itself with grim familiarity: a sudden attack from the sea, the slaughter of monks, and the plundering of holy treasures. For the next 40 years, this became the brutal rhythm of life for the coastal communities of Ireland and the Isles. The attacks were seasonal, a terrifying summer blight. The longships would appear with the good weather, raid exposed monasteries and settlements, and then vanish with their loot and captives before the autumn gales made the sea voyage home too dangerous. They were ghosts, a fleeting terror that disappeared with the changing of the leaves. But around the year 840, the strategy changed in a way that would alter the course of Irish history forever. The Norsemen stopped going home. The raiders essentially decided to skip the worst part of the commute and start working from a remote office, an office that happened to be strategically placed for looting their neighbors. Instead of seasonal raids, they established permanent fortified bases along the Irish coast. The Irish annals call these encampments long fort, literally ship camps. These were defensible positions, often at the mouth of a river where they could beach their precious longships for the winter, repair them, and prepare for the next season of raiding without having to make the perilous journey back to Scandinavia. From these coastal footholds, their reach extended dramatically. They were no longer limited to swift coastal attacks. Now they could campaign year-round, pushing deep into the Irish interior, striking at wealthy inland monasteries that had previously felt safe from the sea wolves. They could forge alliances, exploit local rivalries, and become players in the complex game of Irish politics themselves. They were no longer just raiders. They were an occupying force. One shadowy and powerful figure from this period is a man the Irish annals call Turgesius, or Thorgils in Old Norse. He arrived in the late 830s with a large fleet and seemed to have a grander vision than simple plunder. He systematically campaigned across the northern half of Ireland, attempting to subordinate other Viking groups and establish a unified Norse kingdom. Historians still argue whether Turgesius was a single, powerful historical figure who unified the Norse forces, or a composite character created by later Irish chroniclers to personify the Viking threat. Whatever the truth, his name is associated with the most significant long fort of them all. In 841, a Viking fleet sailed up the river Liffey and established a large, well-defended ship camp at a strategic crossing point. The location was near a dark tidal pool in a tributary river, which the native Irish called the Dubh Linn, the Black Pool. This camp, which the Norse would call Dyflin, was not destined to be a temporary military outpost. It was perfectly situated, with a deep river providing access to the Irish Sea and a defensible ridge overlooking the surrounding lands. It quickly became the premier Viking base in Ireland. It was a shipyard, a barracks, a marketplace for plunder, and, most grimly, the largest slave market in Western Europe. Captives taken from raids all across Ireland and Britain were funneled through Dublin before being sold to the wider Viking world, some ending up as far away as the slave markets of the Islamic Caliphate. This settlement at the Black Pool would, over time, evolve. It would grow from a military camp into a bustling town, a hub of international trade connecting Ireland to Scandinavia, Iceland, and the great rivers of the East. It would become a unique hybrid city, a place of Norse Gaels, where two cultures collided and eventually merged. Though it would be captured and recaptured many times over the next 2 centuries, the foundation laid by those raiders in 841 was permanent. They had, without knowing it, founded the future capital city of Ireland. The establishment of Dublin marked the final transformation of the Vikings in Ireland from a seasonal nuisance into a permanent, nation-shaping power. Their roots were now dug deep into the Irish soil. The establishment of permanent bases in Ireland was a sign of escalating ambition, a shift from plunder to presence. But across the Irish Sea, in England, the Norsemen were about to raise the stakes once more, moving beyond mere presence to outright conquest. The scattered kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons had endured decades of hit-and-run raids, but they were utterly unprepared for what began in the autumn of 865. This was not another raiding fleet. This was an invasion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, with a tone of dread, named it the Mysel Heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. This wasn't the usual summer internship program for aspiring raiders. This was a hostile corporate takeover, and the board of directors had axes. Unlike previous forces, this was a grand coalition of Norse warlords from across Scandinavia and the Viking settlements in Ireland, united for a common purpose. Legend names its leaders as the sons of the famous, and possibly mythical, hero Ragnar Lothbrok. Men like Halfdan, Ubba, and, most notably, the cunning and terrifying Ivar the Boneless. Their stated goal was to avenge the death of their father, supposedly killed by the King of Northumbria. A more practical reason was the lure of England's rich, fertile land and its politically fractured state. England was not one country, but a patchwork of rival kingdoms, Wessex in the south Mercia in the middle, East Anglia, and Northumbria. The army intended to devour them one by one. The massive fleet didn't land and immediately start pillaging. Their first move demonstrated a new and unnerving level of strategic thinking. They landed in the kingdom of East Anglia, but instead of attacking, they made a truce. The local king, likely terrified by the sheer size of the force now camped on his doorstep, agreed to provide the army with horses in exchange for peace. In one brilliant move, the great heathen army transformed itself from a sea-based force into a highly mobile cavalry, capable of striking deep and fast across the land. With their new mounts, they didn't linger in East Anglia. In 866, they rode north into Northumbria. They could not have picked a better time. The northern kingdom was consumed by a bitter civil war between two rival claimants to the throne. The two Northumbrian kings were so busy fighting each other that they barely noticed the enormous Viking army setting up camp until it was politely asking for the keys to the city with the sharp end of a spear. The army stormed the great northern city of York, catching the Northumbrians completely by surprise. The two rival kings, briefly uniting in the face of a greater threat, attempted to retake the city, but were both killed in the disastrous assault. Northumbria, once the intellectual heart of England, collapsed. The Vikings had their prize. They renamed York Jorvik and turned it into the capital of their new, burgeoning kingdom in the north of England. The architect of this early, stunning success was Ivar the Boneless. A master strategist and a figure of immense dread, Ivar commanded the army with a chilling blend of cunning and cruelty. Scholars and saga writers have long debated the meaning of his strange nickname, the Boneless, wondering if it referred to a physical condition that made him unable to walk, a legendary cunning and flexibility, or something else lost entirely to time. Whatever the name meant, his mind was razor sharp. After securing the north, Ivar wheeled the army south in 868 and marched into the heart of England, the kingdom of Mercia. The Mercian king, Burgred, panicked and sent for aid from the last great independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex, ruled by King Ethelred and his younger brother, a promising but, as yet, untested young man named Alfred. The combined Wessex and Mercian forces besieged the great army inside the fortified town of Nottingham. But the Vikings were dug in deep, and the Anglo-Saxons lacked the siege equipment or logistical strength to starve them out. The siege ended in a stalemate. A truce was made, and the army, with its coffers full of Mercian silver, paid to make them leave, simply retreated to the security of Jorvik to wait. The following year, 869, they turned their attention back to their former hosts in East Anglia. This time, there would be no truce. The army swept through the kingdom, and according to legend, captured its king, Edmund. Ivar offered Edmund his life and kingdom if he would renounce Christianity and rule as a Viking puppet. When Edmund refused, he was martyred, tied to a tree, shot full of arrows until he looked like a hedgehog, and then beheaded. With the death of the man who would become Saint Edmund, East Anglia ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. In just 4 years, the great heathen army had shattered 2 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and crippled a third. Only Wessex, the stubborn kingdom in the south, still stood defiant. The army now turned its gaze there, confident that it too would soon fall. With 3 of England's 4 kingdoms broken, the great heathen army fixed its cold, predatory gaze on the last one standing, the southern kingdom of Wessex. In the harsh winter of 870, The army, now led by a Viking king named Bagsec, and the warlord Halfdan, moved south into Wessex territory, seizing the royal estate at Reading and transforming it into a formidable fortress. This kicked off a period of such relentless, brutal fighting that later chroniclers would simply call it the Year of Battles. The fate of the English people now rested on the shoulders of their king, Ethelred, and his younger 21-year-old brother, Alfred. The fighting was savage, and the fortunes of war shifted with dizzying speed. The Saxons and Vikings clashed at Englefield, then at Reading, with victory going first to one side, then the other. The decisive moment of this first campaign came at the Battle of Ashdown, high on the Berkshire Downs. The Saxon army was split into two divisions, one commanded by King Ethelred, the other by Alfred. As the Viking army advanced up the ridge, Alfred saw that the moment to strike was now. But King Ethelred, a pious man, was in his tent, busy praying for victory and refusing to move until the service was complete. Alfred, seeing the Viking line advancing and knowing that hesitation meant death, decided on a more direct approach. In a move of audacious courage, he took command, formed his men into a dense shield wall, and charged like a wild boar up the hill into the teeth of the enemy. The gamble paid off. Alfred's charge smashed into the Viking line, and eventually Ethelred joined the fray. The battle turned into a bloody Saxon victory, with the Viking king Bagsec among the slain. But the triumph at Ashdown was fleeting. The Vikings, though bloodied, were not broken. They regrouped, and in the following months defeated the Saxons in two more battles. In one of these, King Ethelred received a mortal wound. He died shortly after Easter in 871, leaving his young brother Alfred to inherit the crown of a kingdom on the very brink of annihilation. King Alfred's first act was to fight the Vikings to a standstill, and then, pragmatically, to pay them a great sum of silver to leave Wessex alone. It was not a victory, but a desperately needed ceasefire. The great army, laden with West Saxon silver, moved on to London to lick its wounds and plan its next move. For several years, Wessex had a fragile peace, while the Vikings consolidated their power elsewhere. Guthrum, a new and ambitious leader, had taken command of the portion of the army bent on conquest. Then, in the dead of winter 878, he did the unthinkable. Violating all accepted conventions of warfare, which usually ceased during the winter months, Guthrum launched a surprise lightning attack on Alfred's royal court at Chippenham. The Saxons were caught completely off guard, celebrating the 12th night of Christmas. The kingdom collapsed overnight. Alfred, with only a small handful of loyal retainers, was forced to flee for his life, becoming a fugitive in his own kingdom. He found refuge in the trackless, swampy marshlands of Athelney in Somerset. This was the lowest point of his life and of his kingdom's history. From a king with an army, he was reduced to a hunted outlaw, hiding in the bogs. It is from this period that we get the famous story of Alfred and the Cakes. Taking shelter in the hut of a peasant woman, he was tasked with watching some small loaves, or cakes, baking on the hearth. Consumed with worry for his lost kingdom, he let his mind wander, and the cakes began to burn. The woman, unaware she was scolding royalty, returned and gave him a furious earful for his incompetence. It's perhaps the first recorded instance of a head of state being told off by a constituent for failing at a simple domestic task, a deeply humbling moment involving subpar baking. But Alfred was not idle in the swamp. He was planning. From his hidden island fortress, he waged a guerrilla war against the occupiers and sent out messengers to the fyrds, the local militias, of the shires that remained loyal. He summoned them to rally at a landmark known as Egbert's Stone. In a remarkable display of loyalty and hope, the men of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire answered the call, emerging from their occupied lands to reform an army around their king. 7 weeks after Easter, Alfred led his new army out of the marshes and met Guthrum's Vikings at a place called Eddington. The battle was long and brutal. Alfred's men formed a shield wall, a solid line of overlapping shields and spears, and withstood wave after wave of Viking attacks. For hours, the two sides hacked and shoved, a grim contest of stamina and will. Finally, the Viking line broke. They fled back to their fortress at Chippenham, but this time Alfred was not letting them go. He besieged the fortress, and after 14 days, starving and utterly defeated, Guthrum surrendered. The last kingdom had held. With Guthrum and his starving army cornered and beaten at Chippenham, King Alfred held the fate of his enemies in his hands. He could have chosen vengeance, a public execution that would have been celebrated across his ravaged kingdom. But Alfred was a strategist, not just a warrior. He understood that killing Guthrum would only create a martyr, and another vengeful Viking army would surely follow. He chose instead a path of audacious and brilliant political theater. He offered Guthrum not death, but a new life. The terms of the surrender were radical. Guthrum and 30 of his most important chieftains were to accept baptism into the Christian faith, and Alfred himself would stand as Guthrum's godfather. Guthrum, having been comprehensively beaten and facing starvation, decided that if you can't beat him, join him. And if joining him involves a fancy ceremony, lavish gifts, and a 12-day feast instead of an execution, it suddenly seems like a very appealing brand of theology. The ceremony was a masterpiece of diplomacy. Guthrum was brought to the Saxon court, where he was formally baptized, shedding his Norse name for the Anglo-Saxon one Alfred gave him, Ethelstan. For nearly 2 weeks, Alfred feasted and honored his former nemesis, showering him and his men with gifts. By becoming Guthrum's spiritual father, Alfred had elevated himself to a position of moral and political superiority, transforming a fearsome enemy into a subordinate king bound by the sacred vows of his new faith. This personal agreement was soon followed by a formal treaty, a pact that would reshape the map of England. A border was drawn. The treaty describes it in detail, running up the River Thames to the River Lea, following the Lea to its source, then cutting across to Bedford, and from there, following the old Roman road of Watling Street northwest towards Chester. Alfred basically drew a line on the map and said, "Okay, your side of the country can be loud, have complicated naming schemes, and settle your disputes with axes. My side will be quiet, orderly, and will focus on rebuilding." It was the ultimate geopolitical compromise. Everything to the south and west of that line, including all of Wessex and the western half of Mercia, would remain Anglo-Saxon. Everything to the north and east, the former kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia and eastern Mercia, was now formally conceded to the Vikings. This vast territory became known as the Danelaw, the land where the law of the Danes, not the Saxons, held sway. The great heathen army was finally at rest. Its warriors, who had spent years fighting and marching, began the process of settling down. The army shared out the land, as the chronicle states, and the soldiers traded their swords for plowshares, becoming farmers, craftsmen, and lords of the very land they had conquered. This began one of the most significant periods of cultural fusion in English history. The Danelaw was not a place of strict apartheid. Norse settlers and the remaining Anglo-Saxon population lived side by side, trading, intermarrying, and inevitably influencing one another. You can still see the ghost of this settlement today if you look at a map of England. The landscape is littered with place names ending in the Norse suffixes by, meaning village, like in Grimsby or Derby, Thorpe, meaning an outlying farmstead, like Scunthorpe, and Thwaite, meaning a clearing in a forest, like Braithwaite. These names are a living record, a linguistic fossil showing where the Viking farmers put down their roots. The interaction ran deeper than just geography. It fundamentally altered the English language. While the ruling classes of Normandy would later inject French into the language, the Norse settlement gave English many of its most basic, essential words. The influence was so profound that hundreds of Old Norse words became permanently embedded in the English language, including fundamental words like they, their, and them, which muscled out their Old English equivalents. Everyday words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, knife, take, give, and even the word law itself are all direct borrowings from Old Norse, a testament to the daily, intimate contact between the two peoples. Society in the Danelaw also developed a different character, with a much larger class of free peasant farmers, or sockmen, than in the more aristocratic, hierarchical society of Wessex. The Danelaw was now a permanent feature, a Viking kingdom, or rather a series of smaller kingdoms and earldoms, grafted onto the body of England. While Alfred had saved his own kingdom, he had also legitimized a Norse one. The long struggle for the ultimate control of England was not over. It had just entered a new phase. While the sons of the great heathen army were settling the Danelaw and Alfred was busy reinventing the Anglo-Saxon state, an entirely different chapter of the Norse saga was unfolding far to the east. Not all of the restless men of Scandinavia had turned their prows west towards the Christian kingdoms of Britain and Francia. Another stream of adventurers, primarily from the lands of the Swedes, looked to the vast, mysterious wilderness that lay across the Baltic Sea. They were drawn not by a hunger for farmland, but by whispers of unimaginable wealth flowing from the south and east. They sought the Osterweger, the Eastern Way, a path that led to the silver of the Arabs and the silks of the Greeks. While their cousins in England were busy arguing with King Alfred about property lines, these eastern-facing Vikings were more interested in cornering the international market on luxury furs. They were less conquerors and more like the most heavily armed import-export agents in history. Their vessels were slightly different from the classic raiding longship. They were often broader, deeper cargo ships called nars, better suited for carrying goods than large numbers of warriors. Their journey was one of incredible hardship and endurance. They would cross the Baltic, navigating the Gulf of Finland to the mouth of the Neva River. There, they entered a labyrinth of interconnected lakes, rivers, and dense, unending forest. Near Lake Ladoga, they established one of their earliest settlements, Aldingjuborg, a fortified trading post that served as a gateway, a jumping-off point for the immense river roads that stretched south. Unlike the open seas of the West, the Eastern Way was a journey of river travel, and rivers did not always cooperate. The most arduous part of the journey was the portage. At points where one river system ended and another began, the men would have to haul their ships and all their cargo out of the water and drag them overland for miles through the forest on log rollers to reach the next navigable waterway. This was not a task for the faint of heart. It was the equivalent of deciding the best way to get your car across a mountain range was to pick it up and carry it. It required a level of grit, and probably a lot of complaining, that is hard to fathom today. They would follow two primary routes deep into the continent's heart. One was the Volga trade route, which took them down the Great River to the Caspian Sea, giving them direct access to the markets of the powerful Abbasid Caliphate and its seemingly endless supply of silver dirhams. The other great route, which would become more important over time, was the path from the Varangians to the Greeks. This route went from the Baltic down a series of rivers, including the treacherous Dnieper, all the way to the Black Sea. And at the end of the Black Sea lay the ultimate prize, the city the Norsemen called Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople, capital of the fabulously wealthy and sophisticated Byzantine Empire. This journey down the Dnieper was particularly fraught with peril, including a series of 7 major rapids that churned the water into a lethal, rocky chaos. At each one, the traders had to either guide their ships through the maelstrom or unload everything and portage around the danger, all while being wary of attack from nomadic Pecheneg tribes who haunted the steppes. The local Slavic and Finnic peoples who inhabited these vast forests had a name for these formidable newcomers from the north. They called them the Rus. The exact origin of the name Rus, which would eventually give its name to a whole country, is still a matter of scholarly debate. But the most widely accepted theory links it to an Old Norse term for the men who row, rodsmen. Initially, the Rus were not settlers in the same way as their kin in the Danelaw. They were a ruling military and merchant elite. They would establish fortified riverbank settlements from which they could dominate the local Slavic tribes. They weren't looking to plow the land themselves. They were looking to extract its wealth. They demanded tribute, or dan, from the local populations, furs, especially beaver, sable, and black fox, which were like gold in the markets of the south, along with honey, wax, and most tragically, people. Slaves, known as sakaliba in Arabic sources, were a key commodity, captured from the Slavic tribes and sold in the markets of both Constantinople and the Caliphate. This river-borne network of trade, tribute, and violence was the foundation upon which a new and powerful nation would soon be built, forged by the ambition of these men who rowed. The network of forts and trade routes established by the Rus along the great eastern rivers was a lucrative but volatile enterprise. For a time, they operated as a foreign elite, a Nordic mafia extorting a protection tax of furs and slaves from the local Slavic tribes. But a scattered system of tribute-taking is not a state. The transition from a business venture into a kingdom required a new level of organization, and it comes to us in the form of a grand foundation myth. Our main source for this story is the primary chronicle, a history of the Rus compiled by monks in Kiev centuries after the events. Historians view it with caution, debating how much is literal truth versus a convenient story crafted to legitimize a dynasty, but it is a powerful story nonetheless. According to the chronicle, the Slavic and Finnic tribes of the north eventually grew tired of paying tribute and managed to drive the Varangian Rus back across the sea. But their victory was short-lived. Without a common enemy, they immediately began fighting amongst themselves. Lawlessness reigned. Realizing they were incapable of establishing order on their own, the tribal elders held a council and made a remarkable decision. They sent emissaries across the sea to the Rus with a message that would echo for 1,000 years. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. It's the political equivalent of a group of roommates who, after failing spectacularly to create a cleaning rota, decide to hire a very large, heavily armed landlord to tell them when to take out the trash. Answering this unique invitation were three brothers, Rurik, Cineas, and Truvor. They arrived around the year 862. Rurik, the eldest, established himself at Holmgard, a fortress near the future city of Novgorod. His brothers took control of other nearby towns. Within a few years, both Cineas and Truvor had died, leaving Rurik as the sole ruler of the northern lands. He distributed towns and territories to his loyal Norse followers, creating the foundation of a new state and a new dynasty, the Rurikids, that would rule the lands of the Rus for more than 700 years. When Rurik himself died, his son Igor was still just a child. Power passed to a regent, a kinsman of Rurik's named Oleg. If Rurik was the founder, Oleg was the true architect of the new state. He was a man of boundless ambition and strategic vision. He understood that while Novgorod was a good starting point, the true source of wealth and power lay to the south, along the Dnieper River, controlling the trade that flowed towards the golden city of Constantinople. Oleg gathered a large army of Varangians and soldiers from the tribes loyal to him and began a systematic march south. He captured towns along the river, imposing his rule and installing his own men. His ultimate prize was the small but strategically vital hill fort of Kiev, which dominated a key section of the Dnieper. Kiev was already ruled by a pair of Norse chieftains, Askold and Dir, who were not of Rurik's clan. Oleg knew a direct assault would be costly. Instead, he laid a trap. He hid most of his soldiers and sailed up to the town with only a few boats, posing as a simple merchant. He sent a message to Askold and Dir, claiming to be a traveler on his way to Greece, and asking them to come out and greet him as kinsmen. When the two rulers came down to the riverbank, suspecting nothing, Oleg's soldiers sprang from their hiding places. Oleg then held up the young Igor, Rurik's heir, and delivered a chilling proclamation. "You are not princes, nor are you of a princely family, but I am of princely birth, and this is the son of Rurik." With that justification, his men killed Askold and Dir. Oleg's approach to mergers and acquisitions was ruthlessly effective, involving less paperwork and more dramatic declarations followed by the swift removal of the previous management. He immediately seized the city and, recognizing its perfect location, declared, "Let Kiev be the mother of Rus's cities." From this new capital, Oleg began the great work of consolidation. He subjugated the surrounding Slavic tribes one by one, most importantly, defeating the powerful Khazar Khanate that had long demanded tribute from the peoples of the steppe. Now, the tribute of furs, honey, wax, and slaves flowed not to the Khazars, but north to Kiev. He had unified the vast forested lands of the north with the rich river plains of the south. The state known as Kievan Ruses was born, a unique and powerful entity, a massive Slavic body ruled by a Scandinavian head, its lifeblood the great river road that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. With the great river road from the Baltic to the Black Sea now firmly under the control of the Rus's princes in Kiev, their attention was fixed on the glittering prize at the end of the route, Miklagard, the great city, Constantinople. The relationship between the rough, ambitious Russes and the ancient, sophisticated Byzantine Empire would be a complex dance of violence, trade, and eventually profound mutual respect. Before they became the emperor's most trusted soldiers, the Russes first tried to take his city by force. In 907, according to the primary chronicle, Prince Oleg led a massive naval assault. In a likely embellished but nonetheless telling story, When the Byzantines blocked the harbor with a giant chain, Oleg had his men drag their ships ashore and fit them with wheels, sailing them over land to the very walls of the city. Terrified by this display, the emperors offered a hugely generous trade treaty to make him leave. Decades later, Oleg's successor, Igor, tried his luck again. This time, the Byzantines were ready. As Igor's fleet approached in 941, they unleashed their most terrifying secret weapon, Greek fire. This was a liquid incendiary, a closely guarded state secret, likely a petroleum-based mixture projected through bronze tubes mounted on the prows of their ships. It could not be extinguished by water and would cling to ships and men alike, burning them to cinders. The Rus, whose primary experience was fighting with axe and sword, had never seen anything like it. They discovered that showing up with spears was not a guaranteed win when the other side had basically invented the flamethrower. It was a very quick and very hot lesson in technological disparity. Igor's fleet was annihilated. These attacks made one thing clear: Miklagard could not be taken, but the ferocity of its would-be conquerors had made a deep impression on the Byzantine emperors. Always pragmatic, the emperors realized that it was better to have these formidable warriors working for them than against them. They began hiring Rus's mercenaries to fight in their endless wars across the Mediterranean. But the true birth of the legendary Varangian Guard came from a moment of crisis. In 988, the Emperor Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, was facing a catastrophic rebellion that threatened to tear his empire apart. In desperation, he sent an appeal to the new Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir the Great. A deal was struck. Vladimir would send 6,000 of his elite warriors to help Basil. In return, Basil would do the unthinkable. He would give his own sister Anna, a princess born in the purple, to be Vladimir's bride, an unprecedented honor. The main condition was that Vladimir and his entire nation must convert to Orthodox Christianity. Vladimir agreed and dispatched 6,000 of his best Norse fighting men south. This contingent of Rus's warriors proved decisive. They were loyal only to the man who paid them, Emperor Basil, and had no stake in Byzantine politics. They fought with a savage effectiveness that shattered the rebel armies and saved Basil's throne. The emperor, deeply impressed by their loyalty and martial prowess, decided to make the arrangement permanent. He dismissed his unreliable native bodyguards and formally established these axe-wielding northerners as his personal household guard. They were the Tagma ton Varangon, the Varangian Guard. For a young man in Scandinavia or Kievan Ruses, getting into the Guard was the opportunity of a lifetime. It was the best-paying job a Viking could ask for. Travel to an exotic city, carry a big axe, get treated with terrified respect, and occasionally get a closing down sale level of access to the imperial treasury. Their primary weapon was the massive two-handed Danish axe, a fearsome tool that could cleave a man in two. They were the emperor's shadow, guarding him in the palace, on parade, and in the heat of battle. They were known for three things: their unshakable loyalty to the emperor's person, their immense capacity for strong drink, and their terrifying effectiveness in combat. When an emperor died, the Varangians had the traditional right to run to the imperial treasury and take all the gold and treasure they could physically carry, a final, massive bonus payment that made many of them incredibly rich. While initially composed almost exclusively of Russes and Scandinavian Vikings, after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Guard saw a large influx of elite Anglo-Saxon warriors exiled from their homeland and eager to fight. One of the most famous Vikings in history, the Norwegian prince Harald Sigurdsson, later known as Harald Hardrada or Hard Ruler, Served for years in the Guard, he arrived in Constantinople as a penniless young exile and, through cunning and combat, rose to become its commander, leaving years later as one of the wealthiest men in all of northern Europe. The Varangian Guard was the final glittering destination on the Eastern Way, the place where the raw, violent energy of the North was forged into a tool of imperial power in the very heart of civilization. While Norsemen were integrating into the complex societies of England and the Byzantine Empire, another group was pushing the boundaries of their world in a completely different direction, not into the heart of old civilizations, but out into the vast, empty loneliness of the North Atlantic. This was an expansion driven less by a thirst for silver and more by a desperate hunger for land, and above all, freedom. The discovery of the next great Norse frontier was, like many great discoveries, an accident. Sometime in the 860s, a handful of Norse sailors, on their way to the established settlements in the Faroe Islands, were blown far off course by storms. They stumbled upon a massive, mountainous, and utterly uninhabited island. According to the Landnámabók, Iceland's Book of Settlements, the first to intentionally sail there was a man named Flóki Vilgerdarson. He navigated using a trio of ravens, releasing them at intervals to find the direction of land, earning him the nickname Hrafna Flóki, or Raven Flóki. His expedition, however, was not a success. They were unprepared for the harshness of the climate, and a bitter winter killed all their livestock. In the spring, Flóki climbed a mountain and looked down upon a fjord choked with drift ice. In a fit of disappointment, he gave the island its permanent, rather uninviting name: Island, Iceland. It was a name with all the marketing savvy of a modern public relations disaster. He could have called it Greenland, but apparently he wasn't thinking long term. For a few years, this cold volcanic island remained a curiosity, but events back in Norway were about to turn it into the most desirable real estate in the Viking world. A powerful and ruthless king named Harald Fairhair was on a bloody campaign to unify Norway under his sole authority. He was crushing the local chieftains and independent-minded farmers, imposing heavy taxes and demanding oaths of loyalty. For many proud Norsemen who valued their freedom above all else, submitting to a single, overbearing king was unthinkable. Suddenly, the stories of a vast, empty island far to the west, an island with no king, no taxes, and no Harald Fairhair, began to sound very appealing. Iceland became a symbol of liberty, a place to escape to and recreate the old way of life. The Great Migration, the landnam, or land-taking, began in earnest around the year 874. The first permanent settler, according to tradition, was a chieftain from Norway named Ingolfr Arnarsson. As he approached the coast, he performed a solemn ritual, throwing his high seat pillars, the carved wooden posts that symbolized his authority, and the heart of his hall overboard into the sea. He vowed he would build his new home wherever the gods and the tides brought them ashore. It took him 3 years to find them, but they eventually washed up in a bay on the southwest coast. Seeing the steam rising from the numerous geothermal hot springs, he named the place Reykjavik, the Smoky Bay, and in doing so, founded Iceland's future capital. Ingolfr's settlement opened the floodgates. For the next 60 years, a steady stream of ships carrying families, livestock, and all their worldly possessions made the perilous journey across the Atlantic. These were not just Norwegians. Many came from Viking settlements in Ireland and Scotland, bringing with them Celtic wives, servants, and thralls, adding a Gaelic strand to Iceland's genetic and cultural makeup. A settler would sail his ship into an unclaimed fjord, perform a ritual to claim a vast swath of land, and begin the back-breaking work of building a new life on the edge of the world. Once the best land was claimed, the roughly 400 chieftains who now ruled their own little corners of the island faced a problem. They had escaped a king, but how would they live together without descending into endless feuding? How could they make laws and settle disputes? They fell back on the one political institution they all knew and respected, the Thing, or legal assembly. In the year 930, they took a revolutionary step. They created a national assembly for the entire country, the Althing. They chose a spectacular location for it, a natural amphitheater of volcanic rock and chasms created by the pulling apart of the tectonic plates, which they called Thingvellir, the Thing Fields. Here, every summer, the chieftains and free farmers of Iceland would gather for 2 weeks. It was the nation's supreme legislature and its highest court. There was no king, no president, no executive branch. Laws were made by common agreement. The most important figure was the law speaker, whose job it was to memorize the entire legal code of the Republic and recite 1/3 of it from memory each year from a high point known as the Law Rock. It was the most stressful public speaking gig in the world. Reciting 1/3 of the entire legal code from memory every year in front of an audience of heavily armed chieftains who were very particular about legal loopholes. No pressure. This remarkable institution, arguably the world's oldest parliament, established Iceland as a unique and independent republic, a nation of fierce individualists born from the flight from tyranny. The Icelandic Republic was a society built by rugged individualists who had fled a king, but it was by no means a land of gentle harmony. Feuds over land, honor, and livestock were a constant feature of life, settled sometimes in the courts of the Althing, and often with the sharp edge of an axe. It was in this environment of fierce self-reliance and quick-tempered pride that the next great chapter of westward expansion would begin, driven by a man who was too hot-headed even for Iceland. Eric Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Eric the Red. His fiery red hair and beard were a fitting match for his explosive temper. To put it mildly, Eric the Red tended to solve neighborly disputes in a way that permanently lowered the population of the neighborhood. His story of exile began before he was even born. His father had been banished from Norway for manslaughter. The family settled in Iceland, but the violent streak was passed down. The trouble began, as it so often did, over something small. Some of Eric's thralls accidentally caused a landslide that destroyed the farm of a neighbor. The neighbor retaliated by killing the thralls. Eric, in turn, retaliated by killing the neighbor and another man. For this, he was banished from the district. He moved, started a new farm, but his temper traveled with him. He lent his precious ancestral high seat pillars to a fellow farmer named Thorgest. When he asked for them back, Thorgest refused. Another bloody feud erupted, more men were killed, and this time, the case was brought before the Althing itself. The verdict was absolute. Eric the Red was declared a full outlaw for 3 years. He had to leave Iceland, or any man could legally kill him on sight. Now a fugitive with nowhere to go, Eric remembered hearing sailors' tales of a vast landmass far to the west, a coastline of Gunnbjörn's skerries that had been sighted decades before by a mariner blown off course. With his family and a few loyal followers, Eric outfitted his ship, and in 982 he sailed west into the unknown, not to plunder or trade, but to find a refuge where he could wait out his sentence. He made landfall on a coast dominated by colossal glaciers, a truly intimidating landscape of ice and rock. But Eric was persistent. For the 3 years of his exile, he meticulously explored the coastline. He discovered that the southwestern coast, despite the terrifying ice cap that loomed inland, was pierced by deep fjords, and at the heads of these fjords, sheltered from the worst of the wind, were valleys that became surprisingly green and lush during the short Arctic summer. He saw that this land, though marginal, could support the Norse way of life. It had pastures for cattle, sheep, and goats, and the sea was teeming with seals and fish. In 985, his term of outlawry complete, Erik sailed back to Iceland. He hadn't just found a temporary hideout, he had found a new world, and he had a plan. But he needed followers to help him build a colony. He knew that the name island had hardly been a roaring success in attracting settlers, so he devised a brilliant, if somewhat misleading, marketing campaign. He called the new country Greenland. As the saga of the Greenlanders bluntly states, he said that people would be much more tempted to go there if the land had a good name. Erik's pitch was essentially the first great real estate scam in North Atlantic history. Sure, there's a 2-mile thick ice sheet covering 80% of it, but look at this lovely patch of grass by the water. We'll call it Greenland. It's fantastic. While the name was undoubtedly clever marketing, historians and climate scientists point out that during this period, the world was experiencing the medieval warm period. This means Greenland's coastal pastures likely were genuinely greener and more inviting in the 10th century than they are today, so Erik's name was perhaps only a slight exaggeration, not a complete fabrication. His timing was perfect. Iceland itself was becoming overpopulated, and good farmland was now scarce. The promise of a new start, of a vast farmstead of one's own, was a powerful lure. In 986, Erik the Red, master promoter and convicted killer, led a flotilla of 25 ships packed with hundreds of hopeful settlers, their livestock, and all their possessions out from Iceland. The voyage was a disaster. The North Atlantic showed its cruel side, and a terrible storm scattered the fleet. Of the 25 ships that set out, only 14 struggled on to their destination. The rest either turned back or were lost to the waves forever. The survivors, battered but determined, established 2 main colonies in the sheltered fjords Erik had scouted. The larger eastern settlement, where Erik built his own chieftain's farm, called Brattahlid, and the smaller western settlement, several hundred miles to the north. Here, on the absolute westernmost edge of the known world, a new Norse society took root, its survival dependent on a precarious balance of farming and hunting, a testament to the stubbornness of its founder. The Greenland colony, clinging to the edge of a great ice sheet, was the ultimate outpost of the Viking world. From their farms in the southwestern fjords, the settlers would have looked out to the west, across the Davis Strait, and perhaps wondered what, if anything, lay beyond the horizon. They wouldn't have to wonder for long. The European discovery of the Americas, like the discovery of Iceland, would begin not with a grand plan, but with a sailor getting lost. The saga of the Greenlanders tells us that in 986, the very same year Erik the Red's settlers landed in Greenland, a merchant captain named Bjarni Herjolfsson set out from Iceland to join them. He was caught in a dense fog and fierce northerly gales that pushed him far south of his destination. When the weather finally cleared, he and his crew saw land, but it didn't match the descriptions of Greenland. This land was low-lying and covered in forests. Knowing this wasn't his destination, Bjarni, a practical man focused on finding his father, refused to let his crew go ashore. He turned his ship north, sailing for days along the coast. He saw a second land, also flat and wooded, and then a third, this one mountainous and crowned with glaciers. From there, he finally turned east, out into the open sea, and with a favorable wind, found his way to Greenland. When he arrived, his story caused a stir. He was widely criticized for his lack of curiosity. To have stumbled upon unknown lands and not even set foot on them was seen as deeply unimpressive. Bjarni essentially sailed past the entire continent of North America, and his reaction was, "Nope, not Greenland, not my problem." He received a lot of criticism for it, which seems fair. It's the historical equivalent of driving past the Grand Canyon and not even slowing down. The story, however, lodged itself in the mind of a man who had inherited his father's ambition, but not his uncontrollable temper, Leif, the son of Eric the Red. Leif Erikson is described as a wise, capable, and thoughtful leader. Intrigued by the commercial potential and the sheer adventure of Bjarni's tale, around the year 1000, Leif bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35, and set sail to intentionally find the lands Bjarni had only glimpsed. He followed Bjarni's route in reverse, approaching the lands from the north. The first place they landed was the land of mountains and glaciers. Leif went ashore, saw that it was a barren wilderness of flat stones, and declared it a land of no use. He named it Helluland, the land of flat stones. Today, we know it as Baffin Island. He sailed south and came to the second land, the flat, forested country. Recognizing the immense value of timber for the Greenlanders, whose only wood was driftwood or expensive imports, Leif named it Markland, the land of forests, which corresponds to modern-day Labrador. From Markland, they sailed south again for 2 days, before finding a third, far more promising country. They found a shallow bay and a river flowing from a lake. The land was lush. The salmon in the river were bigger than any they had ever seen, and the climate was so mild that their cattle could graze outside through the winter. They decided to build a small base camp to explore further, a collection of turf longhouses they called Leifsbuder, or Leif's Booths. The most famous part of their discovery happened when Leif's foster father, a German man named Turker, wandered off from the camp. When he was found, he was in a state of ecstatic excitement, speaking his native German. He had found something from his own childhood, something unimaginable in Iceland or Greenland. He had found wild grapes. The image of a Viking, a man from a land of ice and rock, getting giddy about finding grapes is a wonderful one. In celebration of this discovery, Leif named this new country Vinland. Historians and linguists still debate the true meaning of Vinland. While the sagas dramatically describe the finding of wild grapes, leading to Wineland, some scholars propose the name comes from an older Norse word, vin, with a short I, meaning pasture or meadow. This would make it the less exotic, but perhaps more practical, pasture land. For centuries, this incredible story was just that, a story preserved in medieval manuscripts. But in the 1960s, the sagas were proven to be history. The Norwegian husband and wife team of Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad, following the sailing directions in the sagas, discovered the remains of a small Norse settlement at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland in Canada. Excavations revealed the foundations of turf longhouses identical to those in Greenland and Iceland, a blacksmith's forge for repairing iron, a technology unknown to the native peoples, and Norse artifacts like a spindle whorl and a bronze pin. Carbon dating placed the site squarely in the year 1000. It was Leifsbuder, they had found it. The Norse Vikings, led by Leif the Lucky, were definitively the first Europeans to reach the Americas, 500 years before Columbus was even born. While the grand sagas of discovery, conquest, and high politics were being written in blood and iron from the rivers of Russia to the shores of North America, the vast majority of Norse people were living lives defined by a much smaller, more intimate world. This was the world of the farmstead, the bear or garter. This was the heart of Viking society, the fundamental economic and social unit from which all the warriors, explorers, and kings sprang. To understand the Viking Age, one must step out of the longship and into the smoky warmth of the longhouse. Imagine a typical farmstead, a clearing carved out of the forest or perched at the head of a fjord. At its center stands the longhouse, a long, narrow building, sometimes with slightly curved walls, like the hull of a ship turned upside down. Its frame is heavy timber, with walls made of wood, wattle and daub, or in treeless lands like Iceland, thick blocks of turf, stacked over a stone foundation. The longhouse was the original open-plan living space, combining kitchen, living room, bedroom, and sometimes even a stable for prized animals into one cozy, smoke-filled package. Privacy was not included in the floor plan. Stepping inside, your eyes would slowly adjust to the gloom. There are no windows, only a few small openings and a hole in the thatched or turf roof to let out some of the smoke from the long rectangular fire pit that runs down the center of the earthen floor. This fire is the heart of the home, providing light, warmth, and a place to cook. Along the windowless walls are raised wooden platforms covered with furs and woolens that serve as benches for sitting and working during the day and as beds at night. The most important person, the head of the household, the bondi, and his wife, would occupy the central part of the bench. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, boiling stew, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and, if the livestock shared the space, the unmistakable aroma of the barn. The master of this domain was the bondi, the free farmer. These men were the carls, the great middle class, and the absolute backbone of Norse society. A man's standing was determined by the success of his farm. He owned his land, had a vote in the local thing, and was expected to follow his chieftain in times of war. His household, or HU, was a large, bustling enterprise. It included his immediate family, but also elderly parents, distant relatives, and hired farmhands. At the bottom of the social ladder were the thralls, the enslaved people who performed the most grueling labor, grinding grain for hours on a heavy stone quern, mucking out the animal stalls, and digging peat for fuel. The mistress of the longhouse, the husfreyja, wielded considerable power within the domestic sphere. While the men were responsible for the outdoor work, clearing land, building, and often being away for long periods trading or raiding, the woman ruled the in-house world. She was in charge of the food supply, from milking the cows and making cheese and butter, to baking bread and brewing ale. She was responsible for clothing the entire household, a monumental task that involved processing raw wool from the sheep, spinning it into thread, dyeing it with plant-based colors, and weaving it into cloth on an upright loom. The symbol of her authority was a set of keys, worn at her waist, which unlocked the chests containing the household's food and valuables. Norse women enjoyed more rights than many of their European contemporaries. They could inherit property, run a farm, and initiate a divorce. While the men were off discovering America or getting into feuds over borrowed furniture, the women were running the entire domestic economy, proving that behind every great Viking was a very competent and probably exhausted woman, making sure there was something to eat when he got home. Contrary to the popular image of the filthy barbarian, the Vikings were quite concerned with their appearance. Archaeological finds across their world include a staggering number of personal grooming tools, combs carved from bone or antler, delicate bronze tweezers, ear spoons, and razors. Arab observers like Ibn Fadlan noted their use of kohl to outline their eyes, and English chroniclers sometimes complained that the Norsemen were too clean, bathing weekly on Saturdays, Laugardagor, which literally means washing day, changing their clothes regularly, and combing their hair, all in an effort to seduce English women. Life on the farmstead was a life of relentless seasonal work, a world away from the high adventure of the sagas, but it was here, in the daily rhythm of farming, family, and survival, that the Viking character was truly forged. A society of proud, armed, and independent farmers, like the ones who ran the Norse farmsteads, needed a way to manage conflict. Without a strong central government or a king to dispense justice, feuds over land, stolen livestock, or injured pride could easily spiral into endless cycles of bloody revenge. To prevent their world from descending into chaos, the Norse people relied on a remarkable and ancient institution, the Thing. The Thing was the bedrock of their legal and political life. It was an open-air assembly, a combination of a parliament and a court of law, held at regular intervals at a traditional sacred spot within the district. Imagine a large field, perhaps with a great mound or a circle of stones at its center. Here, all the free men, the bender of the region, would gather. It was a solemn duty, but also a major social event, a chance to trade, to arrange marriages, and to catch up on the news. At the heart of the proceedings were the local chieftains, the jarls or godar, who acted as leaders and judges. The Thing had two primary functions: to create law and to apply it. New laws were not handed down from on high. They were debated and agreed upon by the assembled free men, becoming part of the oral legal code of the community. But its most common and most vital function was to settle disputes. The process was very different from a modern trial. There were no police to investigate, no prosecutors to bring charges. The entire burden fell on the aggrieved party. If your neighbor stole your prize cow, you couldn't call the authorities. You had to summon him yourself, formally and publicly, to answer for the crime at the next thing. At the assembly, both plaintiff and defendant would state their case before a panel of judges. With physical evidence often lacking, the trial frequently came down to a battle of oaths. Each man would bring a number of oath helpers, friends, family, and powerful allies, who would swear on a sacred ring to the good character and truthfulness of their man. The Viking legal system was essentially a high-stakes popularity contest. The guy who could bring more, and more important, friends to swear he was a stand-up fellow often won the day. This is because the entire legal system was underpinned by the concept of personal honor or reputation, dömer. A good reputation was a man's most valuable asset, as it determined who would support him as an oath helper. A public insult was a serious crime because it damaged a man's reputation and therefore his legal and social standing. Your word and your name were everything. Once a judgment was passed, the punishments were designed not for rehabilitation, but for compensation and social control. The concept of a prison did not exist. For most offenses, the sentence was a fine, a system of compensation known as weregild or man money. The law codes were incredibly detailed, listing a specific price for everything from the loss of a tooth to the destruction of a house, and most importantly, the killing of a person. The fine for a killing was paid to the victim's family to satisfy their claim for vengeance and prevent a blood feud. The size of the fine depended entirely on the social status of the victim. A jarl's life was worth vastly more than a carl's. If an offense was too serious for a fine, or if a convicted person refused to pay, the court could pass the ultimate sentence, outlawry. Lesser outlawry meant banishment for a set period, like the 3 years handed down to Eric the Red. But full outlawry, or skoganger, forest going, was a living death. The outlaw was stripped of all property and all legal protection. He was declared a wolf in sacred places, and anyone could kill him without fear of punishment. He was erased from society. Crucially, the thing had no power of enforcement. The court could declare you guilty, but collecting the fine was your own problem. If the defendant refused to pay, the verdict essentially gave the plaintiff a legal license to attack him and his property, to take the payment by force. It was like getting a favorable judgment and being handed not a check, but a permission slip to go have a brawl with the defendant. This system, a unique blend of formal law and sanctioned self-help, was the glue that held their volatile society together, channeling conflict into a public forum and ensuring that even in a world without kings or police, there was still the rule of law. To live in the Viking world was to inhabit a universe far more crowded and dangerous than the one we know. The Norse people navigated not just the physical landscape of fjords and forests, but a rich and complex inner landscape of myth, magic, and prophecy. Their cosmos was not a simple heaven and earth, but a multi-layered reality of 9 worlds, all connected by the branches and roots of a colossal ash tree, Yggdrasil, the world tree. At the top was Asgard, the fortified home of the principal gods, the Aesir. In the middle was our world, Midgard, or Middle Earth, populated by mortals. And in the bleak lands of Jotunheim lurked the Jötnar, the frost giants, who were the eternal enemies of the gods and the forces of chaos. The gods who ruled this cosmos were not gentle or perfect beings. They were powerful, flawed, and intensely human-like in their passions. The chief of the Aesir was Odin, the All-Father. Odin wasn't a cuddly, all-loving god you'd pray to for a good harvest. He was a terrifyingly intelligent and morally ambiguous figure, obsessed with the acquisition of knowledge and power at any cost. He sacrificed his own eye for a drink from the well of wisdom, and in a shamanic ritual, he hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights, pierced by his own spear, to discover the secrets of the runes. He was a god of poetry, magic, and the terrifying fury of battle, and he presided over Valhalla, the hall of the slain, where warriors who died bravely were brought to feast and fight until the end of time. By far the most popular god, especially among the common farmers and warriors, was Odin's son, Thor. Where Odin was complex and cunning, Thor was straightforward and direct. He was the god of thunder, his chariot pulled across the sky by 2 goats, and his weapon was the mighty hammer Mjolnir. He was the champion of mankind, the tireless defender of Midgard against the giants, whom he dispatched with righteous brute force. If Odin was the master strategist, Thor was the unstoppable heavy infantry. Looming large among the goddesses was Freya, a goddess of the Vanir clan, who were associated with fertility and the natural world. She was the embodiment of love, beauty, and desire, But she was no gentle flower. She was also a fierce goddess of war, who flew into battle on a chariot pulled by cats, and claimed half of the slain warriors for her own hall, Folkvanger. And weaving his way through all their stories was the ultimate wild card, Loki, a giant by birth. But Odin's blood brother, Loki, was the trickster, a being of pure, chaotic intelligence. He was handsome, charming, and utterly amoral, sometimes helping the gods with his clever schemes, and other times leading them into catastrophic trouble for his own amusement.
But above even the gods was the power of fate. The Norse did not believe in total free will. A person's destiny, and indeed the destiny of the gods themselves, was determined at birth, spun into a thread by three mysterious female beings known as the Norns, who lived at the base of Yggdrasil. The goal of a noble life was not to change your fate, which was impossible, but to meet it with courage.
Your Dahmer, your reputation, and the judgment of your character after death was the only thing that truly lasted. This profound fatalism explains much about the Viking willingness to risk everything in battle or on perilous voyages. This led to a distinct view of the afterlife. The glorious death in battle that led to Valhalla was reserved for a select few. For most people who died of old age or sickness, the destination was hell, ruled by a goddess of the same name who was half beautiful woman and half rotting corpse. Hell was not a place of punishment like the Christian hell. It was something arguably worse, an eternal, soul-crushing boredom. It was a gloomy, gray, and cold underworld where nothing ever happened. It was basically an endless Monday, in a realm with no coffee. This entire cosmic drama was heading towards a known, inescapable conclusion: Ragnarök, the doom of the gods. It would be heralded by the Fimbul winter, 3 consecutive winters with no summer in between, during which all bonds of kinship would break down. Then, the final battle would erupt. Loki would lead an army of giants and monsters against the gods on the plains of Vigrid. Odin would be swallowed whole by the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Thor would kill his nemesis, the world serpent Jörmungandr, but would stagger back 9 steps before succumbing to its venom. The world would be consumed by fire and flood. And yet, it was not a definitive end. The Norse worldview was cyclical. After the destruction, a new green world would rise from the sea, and a few surviving gods and 2 human progenitors would begin the cycle anew.
It is a powerful, dramatic, and tragic mythology, and it is crucial to remember that almost everything we know about it was written down by Christians, like the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, centuries after the old faith had died out. Historians still debate how much these accounts reflect pure pagan belief versus how much was reinterpreted through a Christian lens, while Norsemen were building new societies in the West and integrating into ancient empires in the East. A profound and violent transformation was beginning back in the Scandinavian homeland itself. The old world of feuding petty kings and fiercely independent chieftains, the very world that had launched the Viking Age, was being challenged by a new and powerful idea: the unified nation-state.
The first great architect of this change, a man whose ambition was as vast as the northern lands, was a king named Harald. Before Harald, Norway was not a country, it was a geography. It was a long, rugged coastline, indented with fjords, a splintered collection of small territories, each ruled by its own local king or jarl. A man's loyalty was to his family, his chieftain, and his local thing. not to some abstract concept of Norway, but Harold, son of a minor king named Halfdan the Black from the wealthy eastern region of Vestfold, had a grander vision. The sagas, written centuries later by authors like Snorri Sturluson, tell a wonderfully human story about the spark that ignited Harold's ambition. As a young king, he sought to marry a woman named Gyda, the daughter of a neighboring king. He sent his messengers to her, but she sent them back with a scornful refusal. She would not, she declared, waste herself on a man who was king of only a few scattered districts. She would marry Harold only when he had made himself the sole king of all of Norway, just as kings in Denmark and Sweden were doing. This was the ultimate, "you're not ambitious enough for me" rejection. Gyda basically told Harold not to come back until he had a much, much better job title, like king of absolutely everything. Most men would have been insulted. Harold was inspired. Struck by her audacity, he made a solemn public vow. He would not cut or comb his famously long, beautiful hair until he had conquered every part of Norway for himself. For the next 10 years, as he waged his relentless campaign, his uncut hair became a matted tangle, earning him the nickname Harald Lufa, or Harold Tanglehair. His vow meant that for a decade, the most powerful man in Norway looked like he'd been sleeping in a hedge. It was a bold, if not particularly hygienic, statement of intent.
His campaign was a slow, grinding, and brutal process. He used his inherited wealth to build a formidable army and a fleet of large, well-manned longships. He moved methodically from his base in the east, region by region, offering the local rulers a choice: submit to his authority and rule as his appointed jarls, or face him in battle. Many, seeing the size of his forces, chose to bend the knee. Those who clung to their independence were crushed.
It was this very campaign of conquest and centralization that drove the settlement of Iceland, as we remember. Thousands of free farmers and defeated or defiant chieftains chose to flee across the sea rather than submit to Harold's taxes and what they saw as his tyranny.
The final decisive confrontation came sometime around the year 872, though the exact date is debated. A great coalition of Harold's remaining rivals from the coasts of western Norway, reinforced by Vikings from their colonies in the British Isles, amassed a huge fleet to challenge him once and for all. The two fleets met in a fjord near the modern city of Stavanger, in what became known as the Battle of Hafrsfjord.
It was a savage and chaotic naval battle, with ships lashed together, turning the sea into a floating battlefield where men fought hand to hand across the decks. But Harold's forces, battle-hardened and well-led, were victorious. The enemy fleet was shattered, and the last organized resistance to his rule was broken. After the battle, Harold finally allowed his hair to be cut and combed by his friend and ally, Jarl Rognvald. The sagas say that its beauty was revealed, and his nickname was changed from Tanglehair to Harald Harfagri, Harold Fairhair. He had fulfilled his vow, and he married Gyda. He was now the first king of a mostly unified Norway. While Harold Fairhair is a monumental figure in the sagas, modern historians debate the extent and nature of his rule. Some argue that the saga writers exaggerated his power, projecting the centralized kingdom of their own time back onto the past, and that Harold's actual dominion might have been much smaller. But whether his kingdom was total or partial, one thing is certain. His ambition had changed Norway forever, setting it on the long, difficult path from a patchwork of Viking chiefdoms to a single national crown. While Harold Fairhair was forging a kingdom through conquest in Norway, the rulers of Francia were dealing with the Norsemen in a very different way. For decades, the lands of the former Carolingian Empire had been a favorite raiding ground. The great rivers of modern-day France, the Seine, the Loire, were highways for Viking fleets, allowing them to strike deep into the heart of the country, sacking towns and monasteries, and holding entire regions to ransom for Danegeld. The Frankish kings, weakened by internal division, were often powerless to stop them. The Great Siege of Paris in 885 had shown that, while the Vikings might not be able to take a well-defended city, the king's response was often simply to pay them to go and ravage somewhere else. It was an unsustainable and humiliating situation.
By the early 10th century, one Viking leader had become a particularly persistent and powerful thorn in the side of the West Frankish kingdom. His name was Rollo. Like many Viking leaders, his exact origins are shrouded in mystery. The question of Rollo's origin remains a point of national pride and scholarly debate. Norwegian sources claim him as one of their own, an exiled son of a jarl. Danish court historians, however, insist he was a Dane.
Whatever his homeland, his current home was his longship on the river Seine. He and his formidable war band had made the lower Seine Valley their personal hunting ground, and the Frankish king Charles simply did not have the military power to evict him. King Charles, whose posthumous nickname, the Simple, meant straightforward rather than stupid, decided to try a radical new approach. His plan was brilliantly simple, living up to his name. He looked at the Viking leader who was burning down his country and thought, instead of fighting him, what if I just gave him a corner of the country and made it his job to beat up anyone who looks like him? It was outsourcing at its most medieval.
In the year 911, Charles and Rollo met for negotiations and hammered out a landmark agreement, the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte.
The terms were transformative. Charles offered Rollo a huge swath of land centered on the city of Rouen. In exchange, Rollo had to agree to 3 conditions. First, he and his men must convert to Christianity and be baptized. Second, he must accept the king as his overlord and become his vassal, a duke of the realm. And third, and most importantly, he must use his own forces to guard the mouth of the Seine against any other Viking fleets that might try to sail upriver. Charles was turning his greatest threat into his first line of defense. Rollo, a pragmatic leader who likely saw that a future of endless raiding was less secure than being the lord of a rich and fertile land, agreed. He was baptized with the Christian name Robert. The final part of the ceremony, however, provided a moment of high comedy, perfectly illustrating the clash of cultures. To complete his oath of fealty, Rollo was instructed that he must kiss the king's foot as a sign of submission. Rollo, a proud Viking chieftain, flatly refused. An advisor suggested he have one of his warriors do it for him. Rollo gruffly ordered one of his men forward. The warrior, just as proud as his leader, strode up to the seated king, but instead of kneeling, he seized the royal foot and lifted it straight up to his mouth, tipping the king clean off his throne and onto his back. The ceremony was a bit of a clash of cultures. The Franks expected humble submission, while the Vikings' idea of showing respect was to not immediately set your throne on fire.
The land granted to Rollo and his followers soon became known as the Land of the Northmen, a name that softened over the years into Normandy. What happened next was remarkable. These Norse Vikings did not remain a distinct warrior caste ruling over a Frankish population. They assimilated with astonishing speed. Within a generation or two, Rollo's Vikings had abandoned their Old Norse language for the local dialect of French. They swapped their pagan beliefs for a particularly fervent and devout form of Christianity, founding and endowing monasteries with enormous enthusiasm. They traded their longships for war horses, becoming masters of cavalry warfare, and they learned to build the formidable stone castles of their new feudal world. They didn't just become French, they became a supercharged version of the French. They kept all the restless energy, ambition, and ruthless efficiency of their Viking ancestors, but channeled it into new pursuits. They were brilliant administrators, pious churchmen, and arguably the most formidable warriors in all of Europe. This new hybrid people, the Normans, born from a handshake deal between a desperate king and a pragmatic Viking, would soon explode out of their new duchy.
Rollo's direct descendants would go on to conquer not just England, but also southern Italy and Sicily, leaving their mark on the entire medieval world. The poacher had not only become the gamekeeper, his children were about to take over the entire estate.
For much of the 10th century, England enjoyed a period of relative peace and growing strength. The descendants of Alfred the Great, kings like his son Edward and his grandson Ethelstan, had successfully reconquered the Danelaw, pushing the Norse rulers out and forging, for the first time, a unified kingdom of England. The Viking threat seemed to have receded, but back in Scandinavia, the world was changing. The process of state building, begun by men like Harold Fairhair, had continued.
The freelance chiefdoms that had launched the first wave of raids were being consolidated into powerful, centralized kingdoms in Denmark and Norway. When the raids on England began again in the 980s, they were different. This was not private enterprise. This was state-sponsored violence. This was the Second Viking Age. The king on the English throne at this unfortunate time was Ethelred II. History has given him the damning nickname the Unready, but this is a misunderstanding, a dark pun on his name. In Old English, Ethelred means noble counsel. His nickname, Unred, meant no counsel or ill-advised. He was Ethelred the Ill-Advised, a name that perfectly captured his disastrous reign, which was plagued by indecision, paranoia, and spectacularly bad policies. The renewed attacks started small, but quickly grew in scale and organization, often led by figures like the future King of Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, and the formidable king of a united Denmark, Svein Forkbeard. A battle at Malden in 991 became symbolic of the era. The local English commander, in a fit of misplaced chivalry, allowed the Viking army to cross a narrow causeway to engage in a fair fight on open ground. This heroic but foolish gesture resulted in a crushing English defeat, immortalized in a famous Old English poem. It demonstrated that the old Anglo-Saxon warrior ethos was no match for the ruthless pragmatism of the new Viking armies. Faced with this overwhelming military threat, Ethelred adopted a national policy that was both ruinously expensive and utterly ineffective. He paid the Vikings to leave. This tribute, the infamous Danegeld, was extortion on a colossal scale. The scale of the Danegeld payments was immense. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records specific payments, some as large as 48,000 pounds of silver. This drain of wealth is confirmed by archaeology, with vast numbers of Anglo-Saxon coins from this period being found in Scandinavian hoards. Ethelred's policy was like paying a burglar to leave your house, only to have him come back the next year with more friends and a bigger van. The payments showed weakness and simply incentivized the Vikings to return for another payday. Then, in 1002, Ethelred the Ill-Advised made his most catastrophic decision. In a spasm of fear and fury, he ordered that all Danes living in England should be killed on St. Brice's Day. It is unclear how widely this order was carried out, but it was an act of brutal folly. One of the victims of the massacre was almost certainly Gunhilda, the sister of King Svein Forkbeard himself. With this one act, Ethelred had transformed a campaign of extortion into a personal vendetta. For Svein, this was no longer just about silver, it was about revenge and conquest.
The character of the war changed. The Danish raids became systematic campaigns of terror and destruction, designed to break the will of the English people. Finally, in 1013, Svein launched his masterstroke. He landed in England with a huge invasion fleet, not as a raider, but as a contender for the throne. He was a king with the resources of a nation behind him. He strategically landed in the Danelaw, where the culturally distinct population swiftly accepted him as their rightful lord over the distant Saxon king in the south. From this base he swept through the rest of England. Oxford, Winchester, and even London submitted to his authority. Ethelred's kingdom crumbled around him. Left with no support, Ethelred the Unready fled across the sea into exile, taking refuge at the court of his brother-in-law, the Duke of Normandy. On Christmas Day of 1013, Svein Forkbeard, King of Denmark and Norway, was accepted by all of England as its king. The state-sponsored power of a united Scandinavia had succeeded where the great heathen army had failed. A Viking king now sat on the throne of England, having conquered the wealthiest kingdom in Western Europe. The age of Alfred seemed a distant memory. Svein Forkbeard's conquest of England was the culmination of a lifetime of ambition, a stunning achievement that placed the wealthiest kingdom in the West under his command. His reign, however, would be one of the shortest in history. Just 5 weeks after being crowned king, on February 3rd, 1014, Svein died suddenly. His empire, built so quickly, was immediately thrown into chaos. In England, the Viking army occupying the country proclaimed Svein's younger son, a sharp and ambitious teenager named Canute, as their new king. But the English lords, the Witan, saw their chance. They sent a delegation to Normandy to their exiled king, Ethelred the Unready. Their message basically said, "Dear King, we'd love to have you back, but please, for the love of all that is holy, try not to be so ill-advised this time." Ethelred agreed, and sailing back to England with his warrior son, Edmund Ironside, at his side, he quickly raised an army. The young Canute, not yet secure in his power and facing a resurgent Anglo-Saxon force, was forced to abandon his new kingdom and retreat to Denmark. Before he left, he gave the English a grim taste of his character, brutally mutilating the hostages his father had taken and leaving them on the beach at Sandwich. He was gone, but he had vowed to return. He spent the next year gathering one of the largest Viking fleets ever assembled, and in 1015 he made good on his promise. As Canute's invasion force landed, England was once again plunged into war. The situation was complicated by Ethelred's death in April 1016. The citizens of London chose the heroic Edmund Ironside as their king, but the rest of the English nobility, weary of war and perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, gave their support to Canute. What followed was a lightning campaign between two brilliant young commanders. For months, Edmund and Nut fought a desperate war across the English countryside, with Edmund's sheer energy and personal courage winning him several surprising victories against Nut's larger army. The final decisive confrontation came in October 1016 at the Battle of Asandun. It was a long, bloody affair, and the English were on the verge of victory when a famously treacherous nobleman, Edric Streona, fled the field with his men, causing a fatal gap in the English shield wall. Edmund's army was smashed, but he managed to escape. The two young kings, perhaps out of mutual respect for each other's prowess, met on an island in the River Severn and agreed to divide the kingdom.
Edmund would rule his ancestral home of Wessex, while Knut would take the rest. The treaty also stipulated that whichever of them died first, the other would inherit the whole kingdom. Just weeks later, on November 30th, 1016, Edmund Ironside died. The cause was a mystery, perhaps from wounds, perhaps from disease, or perhaps, as many suspected, from poison. Just like that, Knut, not yet 20 years old, was the sole undisputed king of all England. He moved with ruthless efficiency to secure his throne.
To neutralize the threat from Normandy and connect himself to the Old English dynasty, he made a brilliant political move. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, the king he had just overthrown. It was like winning a hostile takeover and then immediately marrying the old CEO's wife to smooth things over with the shareholders. Despite his brutal conquest, Canute proved to be a remarkably effective and even beloved king. He did not treat England as a conquered territory. He issued a new law code based heavily on previous Anglo-Saxon laws and became a great patron of the church. Over the following decade, he also became king of Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, creating a massive North Sea empire held together by sea lanes and his own immense prestige. England, rich and well-governed, was the heart of this empire. Canute, the Viking conqueror, had become a model Christian king, a major figure on the European stage. The most famous story about him, in which he commands the tide not to rise, was not an act of arrogance, but one of piety, a demonstration to his fawning courtiers that even the greatest king's power is nothing compared to the power of God. This Viking warlord had become Canute the Great, the Emperor of the North. While Knut the Great was ruling his vast North Sea empire as a model Christian monarch, the conversion of his Scandinavian homelands was a far more complex, gradual, and often violent affair. The end of the Viking Age was brought about not just by changes in politics and warfare, but by a profound revolution of the spirit. The old gods of Asgard, who had sailed with the raiders and blessed the farmers, were facing a challenge from a new god from the south, the White Christ. The Norsemen's first encounters with Christianity were often as antagonists. They saw the vast wealth of the church in the monasteries they plundered and took Christian monks and nuns as thralls. But through this contact, and through more peaceful trade, the ideas of the new faith began to seep into the Viking world. The first Christian missionaries in Scandinavia had one of the toughest jobs in sales. They were trying to convince a population of heavily armed Thor worshippers to trade in their popular giant-slaying thunder god for a pacifist from the Middle East. The initial reaction was, understandably, skeptical. Early missionaries like Saint Ansgar in the 9th century had some limited success in trading hubs like Birka and Hedeby, but their congregations were small, and the faith did not spread far into the countryside. For the average Norseman, the new religion seemed strange. Their relationship with their gods was transactional. You made a sacrifice to Thor for protection on a voyage, or to Freya for a good harvest. They were willing to add Christ to their pantheon. Another powerful god couldn't hurt. But the Christian insistence on monotheism, on abandoning all other gods, was a major stumbling block. Unlike in the Roman Empire, where Christianity spread from the bottom up among the common people, in Scandinavia, conversion was largely a top-down affair, driven by the ambitions of kings. A Scandinavian king had powerful incentives to convert. Adopting Christianity brought immense political prestige, transforming a barbarian chieftain into a legitimate European monarch, and equal to the emperors of Germany and Byzantium. It brought literacy in the form of Latin-speaking clergy, who could help run a more organized and centralized administration. And most importantly, the Christian model of kingship,
where the king was chosen by God himself, was a powerful weapon for breaking the authority of the local independent chieftains, who were often the guardians of the old pagan cults. The first Scandinavian kingdom to officially convert was Denmark, under the rule of Knut's grandfather, Harald Bluetooth, in the mid-10th century. According to the story, Harald was at a feast with a Christian cleric named Poppo. A debate about religion broke out, and Harald challenged Poppo to prove the power of his god. Poppo responded by undergoing a trial by ordeal, reportedly holding a massive piece of iron, heated glowing hot in the fire, in his bare hands without being burned. Impressed by this miracle, and also under significant political pressure from the neighboring Holy Roman Empire, Harald agreed to be baptized.
He proudly commemorated this event on a massive, intricately carved stone, which still stands in the town of Jelling. The Jelling stone, often called Denmark's baptismal certificate, features the oldest known image of Christ in Scandinavia on one side, and a runic inscription on another, that boasts that Harald was the king who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian.
And yes, it is from this king, who united the disparate parts of his kingdom, that the modern wireless communication technology gets its name. But even a king's decree could not change the hearts and minds of a whole population overnight. The conversion was a slow process of blending and merging, a phenomenon known as syncretism. For generations, the two faiths coexisted. A warrior might wear a Thor's hammer amulet right next to a Christian cross. Artists carved stone crosses decorated with the same intricate serpentine patterns they had used to depict stories from their mythology. Christ was often imagined as a powerful, Christ-like figure, a divine warrior who had triumphed over the old gods in a cosmic battle. But this coexistence was often uneasy, and the push for a more orthodox, exclusive Christianity would lead to bitter resistance and bloody civil wars, as the people of Norway were about to discover. Nowhere was the clash between the old Norse ways and the new Christian order more violent or more perfectly embodied in a single life than in the story of King Olaf II of Norway. His life and, more importantly, his death would cement the hold of Christianity on his nation, but not through gentle persuasion. It was a conversion written in blood. Olaf Haraldsson was a product of the late Viking Age. A direct descendant of Harald Fairhair, he spent his youth as a highly successful Viking mercenary, fighting in the Baltic, and most notably in the wars for the English throne between the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons. During his travels, he wintered in Normandy, the land of the Christianized Northmen, and it was there, in Rouen, that he was baptized. He embraced his new faith with the same ferocious zeal he applied to warfare. In 1015, he returned to Norway with a twofold mission: to seize the kingdom from the Danish Jarls, who ruled it on behalf of Canute the Great, and to make Norway a truly and thoroughly Christian kingdom. He was initially successful in his first goal, defeating the ruling Jarls and having himself declared King of Norway. It was his second goal that would define his reign and legacy. Olaf was no fan of the gentle, blended Christianity that had taken root in many parts of Scandinavia. He was an Orthodox zealot. He traveled the length of his kingdom with his armed retinue, and his approach to missionary work was less turn the other cheek, and more get baptized, or I'll help you meet your God personally. He smashed pagan idols, burned down sacred groves, and gave local chieftains a simple choice: accept the new faith or suffer the consequences, which often meant forfeiture of their lands, exile, or death. His methods were brutal, but they were also political. Every pagan temple he destroyed, and every local chieftain he forced into submission was a blow against the old, decentralized power structure and a victory for his vision of a single, unified Christian monarchy.
This heavy-handed rule created powerful enemies. The Norwegian aristocracy, the very chieftains whose power and wealth he had attacked, grew to despise him. They found a willing and powerful ally in Canute the Great, who still considered Norway his rightful possession. In 1028, when Canute sailed to Norway with his magnificent fleet, Olaf's support crumbled. The resentful chieftains flocked to Canute, welcoming him as their liberator. Abandoned by his people, Olaf was forced to flee, eventually finding refuge in the courts of his distant relatives in Kievan Rus. 2 years later, after Knut's appointed ruler in Norway had become unpopular, Olaf saw his chance. He gathered a small army and returned in 1030 to reclaim his throne. He met the assembled army of the Norwegian chieftains at a place called Stiklestad. Outnumbered, Olaf framed the coming conflict as a holy war, a battle for the soul of Norway. He fought with immense courage at the front of his army, but he was eventually overwhelmed, surrounded, and slain.
The king who had tried to force Christianity on Norway by the sword had died by the sword, and then a strange and miraculous thing happened. In death, Olaf achieved a victory far greater than any he had won in life. The tyrannical king began to transform into a holy saint. Reports of miracles started almost immediately. It was said a blind man stumbled, touched a pool of the king's blood, and regained his sight. A year later, his body was exhumed and found to be miraculously incorrupt, with his hair and fingernails having grown, a sure sign of sainthood in the medieval world. Olaf's swift transformation from a defeated and unpopular king into a national saint was a masterful act of political myth-making. The very same Norwegian aristocrats who had rejected and killed him, now growing tired of Danish rule, championed his cause. The cult of Saint Olaf became a powerful symbol of Norwegian identity and independence. It's a testament to the strange nature of medieval politics that the men who killed Olaf were basically the first in line to declare him a saint.
His body was enshrined at Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim, and his shrine became the most important pilgrimage site in Scandinavia. The violent king was now Rex Perpetuus Norvegii, the eternal king of Norway. The death of Saint Olaf and the eventual collapse of Knut's North Sea Empire ushered in a period of renewed independence for Norway. This new era would be dominated by one of the last and greatest figures of the Viking Age, Olaf's own half-brother, the formidable adventurer we last saw commanding the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, Harald Sigurdsson. After leaving the Byzantine service a fabulously wealthy man, Harald returned to Norway in 1045.
A battle-hardened veteran of countless campaigns, a proven commander, and now immensely rich, he was too powerful for his nephew, the reigning king, to ignore. He was made co-ruler, and when his nephew died soon after, he became the sole king of Norway, known to history as Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler.
For years, Hardrada waged a costly war against Denmark, trying to rebuild Knut's old empire. But in January 1066, news arrived from across the sea that presented a far greater prize. King Edward the Confessor of England had died without an heir. This created a power vacuum that drew in claimants from all across the northern world. The English throne in 1066 was the most sought-after job in Europe. The Witan, the Council of English Lords, quickly elected and crowned the most powerful Saxon nobleman, Harold Godwinson. But across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, prepared his own invasion, claiming the throne had been promised to him. And, in Norway, Harald Hardrada saw his chance. His claim was thin, based on an old political deal, but he was a Viking king in the old style. He believed the strongest claimant was the one who could take the throne by force. Hardrada found a willing ally in Tostig Godwinson, the bitter and exiled brother of the new English king. Together, they assembled a massive invasion fleet of over 300 ships, the last great Viking host, and sailed for England in September 1066. They landed in the north, sailed up the Humber, and crushed the army of the northern English earls at the Battle of Fulford. The great city of York surrendered to Hardrada, who now saw himself as the master of northern England. Meanwhile, King Harold Godwinson of England had spent the entire summer on the south coast with his elite army of professional soldiers, the Housecarls, waiting for William of Normandy's invasion. When the stunning news of the Norwegian invasion and the defeat at Fulford reached him, he did something extraordinary. In a feat of breathtaking speed and endurance, he marched his army north, covering the nearly 200 miles to York in just 4 days. He arrived so quickly that he caught the Norwegian army completely by surprise. On September 25th, Hardrada's army was relaxing in the heat on the banks of the River Derwent at a place called Stamford Bridge. They had won a great victory and were waiting for hostages to be delivered from York. Confident and secure, many had left their heavy mail armor back with the ships miles away. Suddenly, over a ridge, they saw the sun glinting on a forest of spears. It was the English army. What followed was one of the most brutal and epic battles of the age. The Norwegians, caught off guard, scrambled to form a shield wall. A narrow wooden bridge over the river became a desperate choke point. The story of the lone Viking on the bridge is legendary, the ultimate "you shall not pass" moment. A single, giant Norwegian axeman is said to have held the bridge alone against the entire English army, cutting down dozens of men until he was finally defeated by a soldier who floated under the bridge in a tub and stabbed him from below. With the bridge cleared, the main battle was joined. The Norwegians, many without their armor, fought with the desperate fury of their ancestors. Hardrada himself, towering over other men, raged in the front line like a true berserker. But it was not enough. A stray arrow struck the Norwegian king in the windpipe, and he fell. Tostig was also slain. The Norwegian shield wall collapsed. The English victory was absolute. The defeat of the Norwegian army was so total that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that of the more than 300 ships that brought the invasion force, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The last great Viking invasion was over. In the blood-soaked fields of Stamford Bridge, an era had come to a violent and decisive end. King Harold Godwinson stood victorious on the field of Stamford Bridge, the broken remnants of the last great Viking army scattered before him. He had saved his kingdom from the fearsome Harald Hardrada, achieving a victory that should have been celebrated for generations. But he had no time to celebrate. He had won the battle, but the war for England was only just beginning. Harold Godwinson had the worst week in English history. On Monday, he wins one of the biggest battles ever fought on English soil. By Friday, he gets news that another, even bigger army has just landed at the other end of the country. There wasn't even time for a celebratory pint. While he was fighting in the north, the winds in the English Channel had finally changed. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed his invasion force at Pevensey and was now ravaging the south coast. Harold's battered and exhausted army had to turn around and march another 240 miles south to face a fresh, well-equipped Norman army. It was a superhuman effort. He arrived in London, gathered what fresh forces he could, and against the advice of his counselors to wait and gather more men,
he marched to confront William immediately. On October 14th, 1066, the two armies met on a ridge near the town of Hastings. The fate of England would be decided in a single day. The two forces were a study in contrasts. The Anglo-Saxon army under Harold was a classic infantry force in the Viking style. Its heart was the shield wall, a near impenetrable defensive formation of overlapping shields and spears. The Norman army, however, represented the future of medieval warfare. William commanded a flexible combined arms force of archers, infantry, and his ultimate weapon, hundreds of heavily armored knights on horseback. Harold took the high ground, arranging his men in a dense shield wall along the ridge. For hours, the battle raged. The Norman archers fired their arrows uphill, but they fell harmlessly against the wall of shields. William's infantry and knights charged up the slope again and again, only to be repulsed by the resolute Saxon line, the great Danish axes of Harold's housecarls cleaving through helmets and horses alike. The Normans were taking heavy casualties, and at one point, a rumor spread that William himself had been killed, nearly causing a total collapse of his army.
But William was a canny commander. He noticed that when some of his troops broke and fled in panic, enthusiastic English soldiers would break their solid formation to chase them down the hill, only to be cut off and slaughtered by the Norman cavalry. He turned this accident into a deliberate tactic. He ordered his knights to perform a series of feigned retreats, luring more and more of the English off the ridge and weakening the integrity of their shield wall.
The battle raged for the entire day, a brutal, grinding contest of attrition. Late in the afternoon, with the English line worn down but still holding, the decisive moment came. King Harold was killed. How he died is a mystery. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, our primary visual source for the battle, seems to show him being struck in the eye by a high arcing arrow, but it also shows a figure being cut down by a Norman knight's sword right below. Perhaps both are true.
With their king fallen, the English spirit broke. The loyal housecarls fought to the last man around their king's body, but the battle was lost.
William the Conqueror marched on London, and on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, he was crowned King of England. And here lies the supreme irony of the Viking Age. The era that began with Viking longships raiding the English coast ended with the conquest of England. But the conqueror was not a pagan Norseman from Scandinavia. He was William, the French-speaking Christian Duke of Normandy, the great-great-great-grandson of the Viking chieftain Rollo.
The Normans were essentially Vikings who had gone to a French finishing school. They swapped their longships for war horses and their raiding plans for feudal bureaucracy. The original Vikings had been decisively defeated at Stamford Bridge, only for their more sophisticated, disciplined, and cavalry-riding descendants to seize the ultimate prize just 19 days later. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 stands as a towering landmark in history, a convenient and dramatic full stop on the final page of the Viking Age. The defeat of Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge had ended the tradition of great Scandinavian invasions of England, and the victory of the Normans at Hastings cemented a new French-facing order. But an age as vast and dynamic as this one did not simply end on a single autumn day.
It was not a sudden death, but a long, slow fade, a gradual absorption into the very world it had helped to create. The end of the Viking Age came because the Vikings themselves had changed. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo had become French dukes. In the lands of the Rus, the Varangian elite was slowly but surely adopting the language and customs of their Slavic subjects. In Ireland, the Norsemen of Dublin and the other coastal cities were intermarrying with the native Irish, becoming a new hybrid people, the Norse Gaels. And in England, the once distinct population of the Danelaw was being integrated into a new Anglo-Norman kingdom. The Vikings didn't vanish, they assimilated. They became the Normans, the Rus, the English, and the Irish, pouring their restless energy and ambition into the foundations of new nations. At the same time, the Scandinavian homelands were no longer the fractured pagan societies that had launched the first longships. They had become centralized Christian kingdoms, structured much like the other nations of Europe. A young, ambitious man no longer needed to go raiding to find his fortune. He could serve a king, manage an estate, or engage in the continent's growing trade networks. The unique set of pressures, population growth, political instability, and the lure of vulnerable wealth that had ignited the Viking explosion had largely dissipated. The engine of the Viking Age had simply run out of fuel. So what, then, is the legacy they left behind, the echoes that still sound in our modern world? It is vast. They were the great connectors of the early medieval world, their trade routes a web that stretched from the shores of Canada to the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. They founded cities that remain vibrant capitals today, like Dublin, and through their descendants, gave new life to places like York. They were state builders whose dynasties ruled in Russia, Normandy, and England. They created a new nation from scratch in the middle of the Atlantic, the Republic of Iceland, which has preserved their language and literary traditions to this day. And they permanently altered the English language, gifting it with hundreds of the basic words we still use every day. Their legacy is written on our maps in the names of towns and villages, and it flows through the DNA of millions. The image of the Viking, of course, has a life of its own, often diverging from history. The famous horned helmet, as we know, was a romantic invention of the 19th century, more Wagnerian opera than actual warfare. The true Viking was far more complex than the one-dimensional barbarian of legend. He was a raider, yes, but also a farmer, a poet, a lawmaker, a merchant, an explorer, and an artist of exquisite skill. While historians today rightly debate the precise timeline, arguing that the Viking Age faded at different speeds in different places, its impact is undeniable. It was a turbulent, violent, and creative age that irrevocably shaped the development of Europe and left its indelible mark on the world. And so, our long journey through the age of the Northmen comes to its gentle end. The fury of the longships has calmed, and the great armies have marched into the mists of memory. The echoes of their axes and their sagas have softened into the quiet hum of history, a story that now belongs to the ages. The world they knew, of 9 realms and fated battles, has dissolved, leaving behind only whispers on the wind and the weathered faces of ancient rune stones, standing silent guard over fields where kings once fell. The great feasting halls of Valhalla are quiet now, and the dragon prows no longer haunt the coastlines of our minds. All that remains is the story, a tale that has been told and will be told again, now finding its way into your rest. There are no more shores to discover tonight, no more battles to be fought. There is only the calm, steady rhythm of your own breathing and the deep, peaceful quiet that follows a story well told. Let the last images fade like the wake of a ship upon a still sea, and allow yourself to drift into the gentle, waiting darkness, into the soft and silent embrace of your own well-earned sleep.